Human behavior is complicated, and therefore the laws are complicated, and the intersection of these two, what we call law enforcement, can feel very complex. Our society's conversation about criminal justice reform has become a complicated one, but not in ways that necessarily need be so. You already understand the basics, and though you may not feel comfortable saying them out loud, I do. And I suspect that you'll find these ideas to feel truthful to you because you've come to take the golden pill. The two major parties in the media can no longer be expected to represent our interests. They control the information we receive in order to keep us comfortable with their profits and with their power. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more. Let's talk about criminal justice reform. Let's talk about policing, let's talk about policy, and let's separate these two ideas out one from another. Let's first recognize that police are employees. You shouldn't accept this idea that police set policy because they don't. In nearly every instance, police policy is set by politicians, either through state law or at the local level, sometimes in police departments themselves. People still support police generally. In many instances, we want our police departments to be less militant, less willing, less comfortable using physical force, less heavy-handed. And we want our police departments to be more focused on what we think are important issues and less focused on what we feel are unimportant issues. But in general, the public supports maintaining or even increasing levels of police presence. Polling data bears this out. The reason for this, of course, is that policing is the best, most tried and true method of suppressing, reducing crime. This idea of defunding the police is mere sloganeering. And anyone who cares enough about the health and well-being of our communities to have thought about this for more than 15 minutes knows this to be true. Now, of course, the extent to which police deviate from policies that we set as a society, we should also not accept that, not whatsoever. So before we talk about policy, let's talk about police. First, let's recognize that police are human beings. This means that as human beings, police are flawed and police are wonderful in all the ways that everybody else is. But I would argue that in general, police are more likely to be what we would call fair, less likely to be unfair, whether we call that racist or in any other way, more likely to be adherent to policy, to show restraint, than typical, random, average individuals drawn from society as a whole. As cops, we eat, drink, and breathe restraint, control, attempts to adhere to policy every single day. For four basic reasons, I'd like to argue that police are, on the whole, on average, more likely to adhere to policy than people in general. And those four reasons are selection, training, pressure brought to bear, and discipline, if I can distinguish those four ideas one from another. First of all, in terms of selection, first, individuals self-select into becoming police officers. Individuals typically know that they're going to have to deal in all kinds of difficult situations. They're going to have to deal with all kinds of different people. They should be willing to try to be fair and adherent to policy before signing up. Potential applicants are told that they're going to have to deal with difficult situations and they must be fair and they must be restrained. Applicants are then interviewed by the heads of departments and senior police officers in an effort to screen out people who are less likely to be able to carry out their duties appropriately. And recruits are screened out by psychologists who try to identify people who might have a hard time adhering to policy and carrying out their duties in a fair and even-handed way. Are these mechanisms perfect? Of course not. Absolutely not. Are they better than nothing? Of course they are. Many times, individuals are screened out from becoming police officers. Number two, after the application process, the selection process, is training. Police academies hammer home every day the importance of discipline, adhering to policy, acting in a fair way, and instructors in academies try to weed out individuals that might have a hard time doing that. Upon graduation, there's on-the-job training, and then later on, during an individual's career as a police officer, there's plenty of training, ways to maintain discipline and adhere to policy, ways of carrying out your duties no matter how difficult in a fair and even-handed manner. Again, is training perfect? No, of course not. Is it a silver bullet that precludes anything from going wrong? Of course not. Is it better than nothing? Absolutely. Number three, there's a great deal of pressure brought to bear on police officers to do the right thing. Number one, there's peer pressure. Individuals who work with other individuals naturally want to fall into line. Nobody wants to be the jerk who brings shame on his department and disappoints his peers. Number two, police officers are more diverse than ever before. So it's increasingly likely that there'll be individuals involved in any particular situation who have diverse backgrounds. And of course, this enhances peer pressure as well. When dealing with a, say, minority group, a police officer, even if he's not a minority individual himself, certainly has friends who are. Diversity has been a great boon not only to good behavior in police departments, but for police departments' credibility. Individuals work in an increasingly diverse police force and in an increasingly diverse set of communities. Police officers move around sometimes from one community to another and see plenty of different situations from one day to the next. Communities bring a great deal of pressure on police officers to do the right thing. Of course, this is wholly appropriate. And of course, discipline. A great deal of effort is put forth to discipline officers when they behave in ways that we find unacceptable. State laws are in place, as well as departmental policies and local laws. And these laws, rules, policies are enforced by agencies who, if they ever had incentive to make nice with police, certainly they no longer have an incentive to look the other way when things go wrong. For all of these reasons, police officers as individuals are well suited to adhere to policy and show restraint in the face of difficult situations. Are these perfect situations, perfect restraints, controls, and policies? Of course not. But consider the following. Where do you think that there's more, for example, racism in the mind of your typical average police officer, or in the mind of a typical average, say, grocery store worker? If you believe that there is more racism in the mind of a police officer rather than an average person drawn from the population at large, that may say more about you than it does about policing or about racism. The reason that we care so much about police officers veering away from policy and making mistakes at work is because their consequences can be so important. Indeed, can be a matter of life and death, can be devastating. If somebody makes a mistake at work because of racism, for example, at the grocery store, I don't know, maybe you get your carton of eggs packed underneath a gallon of milk at the checkout line. So, turning away from police as individuals, it's important that we talk about the policies. When we talk about policies that govern police, we should probably begin by talking about unions. Unions in the public sector, whether they represent teachers or represent police officers or any other type of public sector employee, can be problematic. Politicians have a hard time standing up to unions. We revere teachers and police officers, and appropriately so. They do tough jobs. But politicians need to do a better job of negotiating for those things that allow them to have greater control over their employees. There are those, I'm sad to say, including some that would call themselves libertarian, that believe that we should do something to abolish public sector unions. Just because politicians don't know how to negotiate with their employees does not mean that for those individuals, those employees, the correct solution is to all of a sudden suspend the Bill of Rights. I understand that we get frustrated with these situations, with politicians' inability to control the situation. But I don't think that the solution is to suspend the Constitution in order to hand more power over to politicians. Police unions have a lot in common with teachers' unions. Police contracts negotiated by the unions limit the extent to which politicians are able to hold police officers accountable. We recognize this as a serious problem in our society. It's very difficult to fire a police officer or a teacher. When individuals are fired, reinstatements are fairly frequent. Holding police officers accountable through punishments is something that's also limited by contracts that are negotiated with the unions. These are things that politicians need to be negotiating for. Perhaps the larger problem is that there are very few incentives in place for police officers, just like other public sector unionized workers, to do a great job. Unions negotiate to have systems in place so that all individuals are paid the same. Consider what this does to the incentives for certain people to go into this line of work in the first place. If you're the type of person who's motivated by money, who wants to do a great job, if you look at the contracts in place, you might come to the conclusion that this sort of industry is not for you. Outside of the purview of the typical contract, politicians also need to be negotiating for control over the use of force, if for no other reason than to build greater trust between the community and police departments. There are movements around the United States to, for example, ban certain holds, chokeholds, for example. That's probably a fine idea on balance. Consider that there are costs to it. We'll talk about those in a moment. There are movements around the United States for what we call de-escalation training. This is undoubtedly a good idea. Not only does it help police officers in tricky situations adhere to policy, but helps build trust between officers and their communities. What we're talking about is training away from what we call today a warrior mentality, with a priority on keeping police officers safe. Communities need to be able to trust police officers that they hold their best interests in the palm of their hand as well as their own individual interests. And so training away from the warrior mentality may be, on balance, a good idea, but remember, there is a balance here. To the extent to which we move away from prioritizing officer safety, it means that it may be marginally, or over the long run, quite a bit, more difficult to recruit police officers. Or at the very least, perhaps we should be prepared to pay more to attract the type of individuals that we want to have serve as police officers. And of course, writing employee contracts in a way that incentivizes good workers to do a great job is also a part of this very important puzzle. None of this is to suggest that it's not a good idea to move in this direction. But we do need to bear in mind that there may be very likely a cost associated with it in the future. Let's talk about qualified immunity. The right to access courts in order to attempt to achieve a correction to the violation of one's rights is a basic principle of democracy. It's a fundamental plank of our Constitution. To the extent to which this process can be interrupted by qualified immunity as it stands today, change is necessary. Based on the reaction of most police officers to this potential change, based on the reaction to my brothers, I believe that there is some misinformation out there that I'd like to talk about. First of all, put yourself in the position of a police officer. As disturbing as it might be to not be able to achieve redress through the courts, to try to achieve some sort of correction to a rights violation, that is disturbing. Imagine how disturbing it would be for a police officer if you felt that you could lose everything, not just your job, but the pension that you've been working toward. Possibly not even that, but your personal assets. Maybe you could lose your house if you made a mistake at work. Would you be willing to do the job? Consider the alternative. If you, again, worked at a grocery store and you made a mistake, maybe we're literally talking about spilled milk. If you make a mistake at work as a police officer without much time to think about what to do in a tricky situation, the results can be catastrophic. Literally, from time to time, a mistake can mean the difference between life and death. This is why we need to take these issues so seriously. Not because police officers are any more likely to be accident prone than anybody else, but because the issues at hand are so important. The idea of changing qualified immunity is not so that police officers as individuals can be personally on the hook for millions of dollars in liability for making a mistake, but rather so that their employers can be on the hook. Employers, municipalities, need to understand that they would have to indemnify police officers. This means that they would have to put measures in place to limit their own liability as employers. This means better training and better control mechanisms, as we were discussing just a moment ago. It means negotiating with police unions in order to get more accountability, better systems in place to hold police officers accountable, and being willing to pay police officers accordingly. Not only to put up with what might be more accountability, what might be more likely situations in which you might get fired, but also to attract the types of individuals that you want to be able to motivate to do a great job, not just a good job. Such indemnification would create greater incentive to train officers in a more liability-avoiding way. This may not be a bad thing. We do need to keep in mind that on balance, this may create costs for municipalities. I think costs that municipalities should probably be willing to pay. Maybe the most obvious area of criminal justice reform in need of serious and swift change is what we now call asset forfeiture. Understand what asset forfeiture actually means. It's a set of police procedures that can be put into place by police departments so that individuals can lose their vehicle, their cash, sometimes other assets, sometimes even including their house, without a court order indicating that they are to be subject to some sort of punishment, that this is part of some sort of sentence. This is prior to being convicted of a crime. Understand, this is not merely just a horrific violation of the Constitution, which it is, it's actually worse in some sense, in that police departments have an incentive to follow these procedures as frequently as possible, because in many cases, in most cases, the value of those assets, they can be sold off, or in some cases the assets themselves can just be used for the benefit of the police departments. So there is an incentive not only for police departments to put these procedures in place to seize assets as often and as large as possible, but to focus on just those particular crimes that are likely to yield assets. Unfortunately, possibly putting on the back burner other types of law enforcement less likely to yield assets to the benefit of the police department. Criminal justice reform must include the decriminalization of drug use. As a society, we've come a long ways in terms of tolerating certain behaviors that we used to abhor, including those that we used to deem criminal. By creating an environment in which people don't have to hide their behavior, from police because their behaviors are deemed to be criminal, we can make the world a better place in which to live. We certainly can create a world that is more sane. By decriminalizing the possession of drugs, indeed by decriminalizing even the sale of those drugs that are neither fraudulently dangerous or dangerously fraudulent, we can create an environment in which people are safer. They feel safer to come forward to get the help that they need. As any officer can tell you, the two big reasons why certain types of problems go unreported to police is because people are hiding from police in order to protect either a domestic relationship, or the other reason is protect themselves because of a drug problem and they're afraid that they'll be prosecuted. I believe that police are likely to remain a critical component of whatever set of solutions that we come up with to battle this national scourge of drugs. But the criminalization of drugs, perhaps ironically, is what's hampering the ability of police to serve in this critical role. The state's heavy-handed approach to controlling human behavior drives a sort of wedge between communities and those citizens in the community who are employed to enforce the state's controlling inclinations, the police. Remove this wedge by backing off the nanny state attitude toward human lives would allow people to work together in more productive ways to solve real problems. Problems like drug addiction and violence in the drug trade, as well as violence in the prostitution business, as another example. Remove this wedge by backing off the nanny state attitude toward human lives, and you'll allow people to work better together to find real-world solutions to real-world problems. Problems like drug abuse, problems like violence in the drug trade, and as another example, violence in areas like prostitution. Politics has become a battle between, on one side, those politicians and pundits, journalists and jurists, revisionists and regulators, who have a faith in government to find solutions to your problems better than what you can come up with on your own. On the other side of this battle are history, science, people like you, people like me, and common sense. Thanks for helping me make this sense a little bit more common, and thanks for coming to take the gold pill. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more.